On today's episode of the Black Studies Podcast, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Annette Joseph-Gabriel, John Spencer Bassett, Associate Professor of Romance Studies and Associate Professor of Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies at Duke University. She is the author of Reimagining Liberation: How Black Women Transformed Citizenship in the French Empire, which was awarded the Modern Language Association Prize for a first book, honorable mention for the Eugene Weber Award for Best Book in Modern French History, and was a finalist for the Fête Cannes Marseille Condé Literary Prize in France. She is the co-editor of Shirley Graham Du Bois, artist, activist, and author in the African Diaspora, forthcoming in November 2025 from the University of Pennsylvania Press, and is currently working on her second monograph, Enslaved Childhoods: Survival and Storytelling in the Atlantic World. She has had op-eds, commentary, and profiles of her work featured in outlets including Al Jazeera, HuffPost, The Washington Post, Le Monde, France Culture, France 24, and Radio France Internationale. She is a recipient of the Carrie Chapman Catt Prize for Research on Women in Politics, and her research has been supported by awards from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Humanities Center, among others. She is the senior editor of Palimpsest, a journal on women, gender, and the Black International, co-editor of the Global Black Writers in Translation series at Vanderbilt University Press, and is serving this year as a judge for the National Book Awards. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Annette Joseph-Gabriel, the John Spencer Bassett Associate Professor of Romance Studies at Duke. How are you doing today, Dr. Joseph-Gabriel?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I greatly appreciate it, especially in the interim, this time off, that we have.
Yes, thank you for having me.
So we can get started so I don't take too much of your time. So how did you get into Black Studies as a field, and what keeps you committed to doing the work of the field?
So I guess I don't know that I necessarily have like an origin moment or an origin story. I kind of grew up a Pan-Africanist, which is a little bit of a weird thing to say, but just as far as I can remember, like in high school, I went to a high school whose motto was knowledge in the service of Africa, and the school anthem was a South African national anthem. Like it was just a very sort of like multicultural kind of setting with a strong focus on Pan-Africanism. And I remember in high school, in my senior year, I wrote a 20-page paper, which in high school is a huge deal. It took me like all year to write that paper. But it was for my English class, and it was a paper on the representation of African women in two novels. And thinking about that now, like several decades later, I'm kind of a little startled to realize that my first book is basically an expansion of an essay I wrote in high school. But really, all of this is to say that kind of thinking about the Black world through the study of African literature has always been sort of my way of making sense of the world for as long as I can remember. And so when I got to undergrad, Black studies, or there it was called Africana Studies, was where I gravitated to kind of continue to make sense of the world. And so it just sort of things have kind of unfolded from there. But I think that's also what keeps me committed to the work, is that this really is the only way I know how to understand the world and my own kind of being in and moving through the world. And so that's sort of how this began and how it's continuing.
Thank you. I think it's amazing that your first book basically was an extension. That is an amazing arc and trajectory. So how would you situate yourself in relationship to the different disciplines that you operate in? Like you're in romance studies at Duke, also in gender, sexuality, and feminist studies. The work you do does center Black people and people across the diaspora, and thinking about how we reclaim some of the gaps and silences, and even if that's a thing that we should be doing, which I'm going to ask about in a second. But how do you situate yourself in relationship to the disciplines that you operate across?
Yeah. So I guess like just a couple of months ago, I got my secondary appointment in African and African American studies at Duke. So yeah, I'm so excited by that. Because for me, it kind of feels like an intellectual home. When I think about how I situate myself in relation to disciplines, I think of myself primarily as a literary studies scholar. Like I really claim literary studies as my intellectual home, or one of them. And the thing that's interesting for me is that literary studies is not really the name of a department, at least not in anywhere that I have been. There is a department of literature at Duke, but that's a different kind of thing. But like you might think about English or French or Spanish and Portuguese as sort of department names and traditions that are beholden to nation and territory. But literary studies for me is a set of critical questions and intellectual tools that are really sort of the bread and butter of my work. And so that's sort of how I situate myself disciplinarily. I think that in grad school, the sort of Black Studies was a certificate as opposed to like a full program at the time. And in doing that certificate, I was trained by Black women historians or Black women scholars who are sort of adjacent to history or who take history very seriously. And from that sort of like constellation of Black women scholars, I learned how to think about history as a literary scholar. By which I mean I learned how to read historical documents or historical sources using the tools of literary studies. So while I don't identify myself as a historian because I am not trained in sort of the methods of history, and those are not quite the questions that I ask, I do recognize just sort of the degree to which I lean on history, the degree to which my work really isn't possible without the work of historians. And so that's a field that I'm kind of constantly in conversation with or in engagement with as well. But I really kind of situate myself as a literary studies scholar. And I take from that sort of methodological apparatus the things that are useful to me, right? So things like, what counts as French or Francophone, or, like the national and imperial borders, that's not my cup of tea. So, like just however people want to delineate or gatekeep or whatever, that's their business. The way that I come at these disciplines is to think about the kinds of questions that they allow me to ask. And in literary studies, what I really appreciate is that we're constantly, or at least I'm constantly thinking about how is language in a given moment being used to make meaning? Like that's the question that is always at the center of everything that I'm kind of thinking about. And so that's sort of how I think about myself in relation to discipline.
Thank you. I want to follow up on that briefly. So how do you see your background in like being raised Pan-African? How do you see that as influencing how you approach that question?
Mm. Oh, that is very interesting. I think that influences first and foremost the kinds of text that I'm interested in.
Mhm.
And so, for example, when I took like my first Africana Studies course in undergrad, a formative text for me, like a text that sort of like just stopped me in my tracks, was Aimé Césair's Notebook of a Return to a Native Land. And I mean, I'm coming from like an Anglophone context. I am coming from an independent country that, has, as far as I know, no kind of connection to a place like Martinique and its kind of sort of ongoing colonial relation with France. And yet so much in that book just felt so resonant that I had to kind of sit back and think about what does it mean to find echoes of experiences in a text that is written in a completely different time, set in a completely different place, engage with a different language tradition, right? Like, what does it mean to find sort of echoes and things that resonate? And so to then start to think about, right, how we think about Blackness in a global context, right, as a set of relations that are constantly shifting, but that certainly are not confined by sort of national borders or even temporal borders. And so for me, I think that, that sort of Pan-Africanist background, first and foremost, was what kinds of texts do I gravitate to? What kind of works do I find interesting? And then secondarily, or to a secondary degree, what are the questions that I am asking of those texts that I think are interesting. And those are always questions about, like who's getting left out of a narrative, or what are alternative ways that we might think of the world, when I think about the world when we focus on the people or the intellectual traditions that get left out of narratives. So yeah, that's kind of a long-winded way of approaching it, but that's kind of how I think about that.
Thank you. I appreciate you elaborating on that. And that I really like that the phrasing echoes of experiences. I think that fits so well with the next question that I'm going to ask you, which is leading into the mapping Maroonage project that you did, the course that you taught at University of Michigan. I went to Michigan State, so. But
that's okay. We can still be friends.
Yeah, I just need this conversation. But both the project itself, but also having undergraduate students engage in that type of narrative building from the silences and the fragments that exist in archives with regards to Black people, I think is really, really interesting. So both that, but also how do you see your work as a teacher, or how do you see your pedagogy as being informed by Black studies, but also literary studies, because that is where you situate yourself, and the trajectory of the questions that you've asked over time?
Okay, I'm hoping I can kind of do the two parts of the question justice. So please kind of reel me in if I deviate too far. I think so. So the Mapping Maronage project it comes out of a series of classes that I courses that I've taught called Mapping the French Atlantic, and I say a series because I've taught the class twice now. And it's an interesting class because I think, far more than any other class I've taught, this is the one that students really take ownership of, because their final project is both really daunting and really straightforward. Like, it's a very short final project. Their final project is like 2 or 3 sentences long sometimes, depending on how much information they can find. But essentially, I identify, certain figures in archives that I'm able to find. So enslaved people in archives I'm able to find, in Quebec, in Paris, in Martinique, elsewhere. Because it's a French class, we focus mostly on the French-speaking world, but we also go, across. And their task is to tell a story about this enslaved person from the documents that they have found. And in the beginning, they're kind of perplexed, like, why will it take me an entire semester to write one paragraph about this person? Until they start reading, they start reading about like all of the distortions and the issues and difficulties with the archive. And then they have to think about what it means to tell an ethical story to the degree that they can. And students really take ownership of the class, because I tell them that the stakes of this class have very little to do with you and your career prospects and your future. The stakes really are about you and this enslaved person, that no one has told their story before until now, and it is in your hands. And suddenly they're like, oh my goodness, I'm beholden to somebody, right? Like, not like a grade or a future employer or whatever. Like, I'm beholden to somebody who walked this earth and went through these things, and now I have to tell their story or figure out how to do that. And I think that kind of investment in being in relation with someone is really what makes students do such an amazing job. Like, everything, nearly, so like 90% of the content on that website, Mapping Maronage, is student generated. I did one example for them, and they did everything else. And so, yeah, I think that in terms of, the question you asked had to do with pedagogy. This is going to sound a little bit roundabout, but I will try to connect it back to Mapping Maronage. The thing about pedagogy for me is, first of all, being aware of where I am and what makes my work in Black studies possible. Mm-hmm. And that the reason why this even exists as a field in the first place, right, is that at a particular moment in the 20th century, student student activists, right, like were involved in making these demands for the creations of courses and, sort of rectifying a curriculum that from which they had been written out of. And so when I think about my scholarship and my teaching situated in Black studies, I think first and foremost about being beholden to the students who made this field possible for me to even do this work in the first place. And then being beholden to the people about whom I write, or the people about whom I teach, or the people about whom we're studying, or the people we're studying in the class. And so that is what informs this final project, which, for students, it's not very long. It's not a 20-page paper, it's not. But it is, the stakes of it are that you are beholden to this person about whom you are writing. And so sometimes students kind of forget that I'm there, that I'm the reader of this thing. They're going to get a grade. They're very invested. I'll tell you, one student once came up to me at the end of a class and he said, I am very invested in this woman's life. And he walked away and I was like, okay, I don't know what I'm supposed to say in response. And he came back with more sources than I had found about this woman that I had been researching. He had gone and read like footnotes of some botanists who were fighting over vanilla in Madagascar. And she had been enslaved to one of those botanists. Like he dug deep into the sources. And again, like I very rarely get students going above and beyond in that way. They do so in other ways, but not so much in this way. And so, all of this to say that the thing that is my North Star in my pedagogy, I think, or I hope, filters into a class like Mapping Marronage, which is that we are first and foremost indebted to those who have come before us, and we're indebted to those who have made it possible for us to even gather in the classroom and be in a course like this, right, with institutional support. And so that what we write and the questions we ask always have to place those people and their lives and experiences at the center.
Thank you. So I know that was a particular course that you taught. You've run it twice. What other courses have you taught to both grad and undergrad students? And how do you see this responsibility, the beholdenment to both people who develop the field that allows us to teach these classes and ask these questions, but to also maybe those who are unnamed or whose stories have not been properly told?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because, like, right now we are in this moment where we're sort of trying to work through the consequences and implications of just sort of our work and our teaching being exposed to the hostile scrutiny, right, of those in power. And
Right.
so I've sort of been taking stock of the classes that I teach, and trying to think about, like, okay, how might these classes meet students' needs in the present moment? And, it's a question that I asked and a stock taking that I did during the pandemic because that was a particular kind of moment again, right? Like, there was a lot going on there. And now we're in another kind of moment where, the question returns, right? Like, how do we meet students' needs in this moment? And so I'm taking stock of my classes and I realized that nearly all the classes I teach have Black in the title. And like when you think about, okay, like how exposed am I to scrutiny and, like, do I want to be, or, like just kind of working through those questions. Like I teach Black France. I teach, one of my all-time favorite classes is Black girlhood in French cinema, which is just a class on Black girls in French cinema. Like just we watch movies and we think about all the representations of Black girls in French cinema. And we start from like the OG, right? Like Ousmane Sembène's, Black Girl, and, like thinking about the title of that film, and, so we're starting from the 60s and we make our way down to present moment. I teach Black in translation, which I co-taught. It was a very kind of ambitious class where I co-taught this with a professor at Rutgers. And that was an English class there and a Romance Studies class here at Duke. And we read, essentially everyone in the class was reading the same book, but in different languages. The English folks read it in English. The French folks read the book in French. So we read like Toni Morrison's A Mercy. We read Césare's Notebook of a Return. We read poems by Nicolas Guillen, translated by Langston Hughes. We were reading, there were like folks reading in Spanish. It went all over. It was a very ambitious class because it got kind of unwieldy, I think, but in a very good and productive way. But all of that to say, right, like, it's all Black everything. And I'm like, I don't even know how I would rebrand this in any kind of way to fly under the radar. Like, I don't know what you want me to tell you. These are classes of all Black people. But like when I do that stock taking, it's also right for me, that thing about being beholden is that when I think about like what are the gaps that need to be addressed, right? And let's say in a field like French, like the study of French, where even the fact of thinking about race is already contentious because, France has this sort of like colorblind policy, et cetera, is that these are the classes that I think meet that moment. These are the classes that I think meet or respond to those gaps and those erasures, right? It's classes that make students aware of more expansive ways to think about the world, more expansive ways. If you're going to study abroad in Paris, well, here are some things that you can think about, right? Like before you get there. When you come back, let's take stock of how Paris maybe didn't quite look like the way you thought it did, from the postcard image, et cetera, right? And so, just kind of ways for students to think about the world. And then, I also get a lot of Black students in my classes, but I was thinking about their place in the world and how they navigate the world and how the conversations that they're having now have been had in different ways at other moments in time, and what they can take from that. So, yeah, I think that's sort of how that informs the other classes I've taught, is just always making Blackness central to the intellectual questions that we're asking. I think that my colleagues and I are asking similar questions across our different courses, whether we're teaching 20th century cinema or Black girlhood in French cinema. We're asking similar courses, right? But I'm sort of centering maybe a different population or a different set of intellectual traditions than others might. So, yeah.
Thank you. So I want to ask, what interests you most about the past of Black studies? And that can be like Black studies as a field, but like broadly defined, right? Because it didn't start in the academy. It may not stay in the academy, but here we are. So,
Yes.
and especially because like your high school paper like was a Black studies paper. What interests you about the past of how we think about these methods and these questions and centering Blackness broadly defined?
Yeah. That is an interesting question. I think one of the things that interests me is the kinds of conversations that people have had in the past about what it means to be Black and how people have had those conversations, sometimes talking to or past each other, sort of across geography and language and discipline. And so when I say that, I'm thinking specifically about sort of the crop of journals that were published in Paris in the interwar years. So, journals like La Dépêche Africaine, journals like La Revue du Monde Noir, so the Review of the Black World. And these were, sometimes like bilingual journals, right? Like where the writing would be, in French and in English, kind of on opposite pages, and where the voices of, like doctors and journalists and students and poets from Africa and the Caribbean and the United States all coincided. And some of them were from French colonies, and others were subjects of other empires. And some thought some were more privileged than others, and some thought some could understand certain forms of oppression, others couldn't. And right, like they were these conversations that were rigorous and generative, and sometimes difficult and painful. But they were conversations that, like we're still having today. Like we're still having those conversations on social media. We're having them in books. We're having them, right, like I guess on podcasts, because they're conversations that we're still having today. And for me, it's that ongoing nature of this question that maybe we won't ever be able to answer in a kind of a singular way. And maybe that's what's rich about it, right? Like the plethora of experiences of what it means to be Black. And I'm thinking, for example, about like, sometimes you'll hear, people who come to the United States from parts of Africa who say like, I didn't realize I was Black until I came to America. And I'm like, that's interesting. Tell me more. But also, right, like I'm interested in the echoes of what that assertion might have sounded like in 1920 in the Review of the Black World, right? Like, when a Senegalese person arrives in Paris as a student, right? So like, I'm just very interested. I think that's what interests me most about the past of Black studies is all of these moments in the past, like key moments in the past where these conversations have been had in a way that is visible, that is multilingual, that is sometimes contentious, but that I find just really generative and endlessly fascinating. So I like to kind of like eavesdrop on those conversations then and now. I'm very conflict avoidant, so I'm like, ooh, I'm just here to listen and learn. But I think there's something just so rich and beautiful and messy and difficult about those conversations that I really appreciate, and I keep returning to them.
Thank you. I definitely, I think it's so interesting, as you said, to think about the conversations that keep happening, right? These aren't new conversations. We're just in a particular context right now that might not be as different as we think it is from past contexts, but we're here. Um, and the fact that the conversations keep happening. So there isn't an answer, there isn't an endpoint, it's a constant conversation. I agree. And I think that is super interesting. So given where we are, what interests you most about the future of the field? Or maybe even what questions do you think are very important for us to be asking or exploring or returning to right now?
Um, I you know, I don't know. I don't know that I could think of like a question that most interests me. I think probably like at 2 in the morning, I will sit up in bed and be like, that's the question that I should have said. But I mean, in terms of like what interests me most about the future of the field, um, I mean, it's a weird time to kind of think about the future of anything, and especially of this field, like right now. And yet we must, right? Because that is kind of what keeps us in action, what keeps us going. Um, I think what interests me is all of the things that we don't yet know. So I'll explain what I mean by that. Is that so right now I'm working on a book about how children who were enslaved or who lived in the orbit of slavery in the Atlantic world in the 18th and 19th centuries, how they wrote about slavery, how they wrote about their experiences, about their lives. And so it's a book about enslaved children. And one of the people I'm writing about is a young girl whose family was enslaved in, at the time, Saint-Domingue, but who herself is born free in New York after her parents are freed. And I came across her letters just sort of by chance in the New York Public Library. And there are, as far as I can count, 456 of her letters. Like, there's a small Black girl in New York in the 19th century who left behind a meticulous archive of her family's life and of the city of New York. Like, she was an avid opera goer. She's writing between the ages of like 7 and 14, so this is like a child. And she like goes to the opera, she goes to the market. She knows what you can buy on Broadway. Like, she knows, like, she is navigating the city. And when I think about what interests me about the future of the field, it is going back to this past moment and looking at this incredible and extensive archive left by a child and thinking about all the things that we haven't yet encountered, right? Because what I'm trying to do is not just narrate like what she did and where she went. It is to try to figure out, how do you narrate a Black family story through the narrative form that a child used in her letters. And so I'm here to learn from her, right? How to tell this story. And so it's a journey of discovery for me. And that's what interests me most, I think, about the field of Black studies. I know that we lament gaps and silences a lot, but for me, I also see those as encounters that are waiting to happen, right? Like, sure, gaps and silences, but here are 400 plus letters by this little girl who's recounting everything from New York to Paris to Haiti, because she has family members that she's writing to, like across continents. I haven't even begun to like scratch the surface of everything I could learn from her. And so that for me is what is energizing and exciting, right? Despite everything that's happening right now, despite the loss of institutional support that we're facing right now, despite like the targeted erasure of our work and the caricaturing of the kind of work that we do to vilify it, despite all of those things that are happening right now, there are all of these incredible encounters that if I have to walk from where I live to New York City to go read those letters, then I will walk and go to New York City and try to read those letters without the support that but right, that we continue to do this work, and B, that in doing that work, we're encountering our own paths, we're encountering our own lives, our own selves, our own intellectual traditions that are there, right, waiting for us to receive that knowledge. So yeah, I guess I was a little bit uncertain how to answer the question, because I was like, oh goodness, what is there to look forward to in the future? But for me, I think that's part of the promise of Black studies, whether it's like you said, right, whether it remains a field or whether it's work that we do in other settings, or whether it's both of those things, right? It has always been and still is both of those things. That there's so much there's so much left for us to encounter and to learn from. I'm trying to be careful not to use words like discover, because I'm trying to unlearn sort of the vocabulary of sort of like a colonial conquest and discovery and exploration, etc., right? But to think about encounters and how we might encounter ourselves anew in all of these works that are all of these texts and documents and images and material archives that are waiting for us.
Thank you. That I don't think that there's anything else I can say. That I really, really love the framing of encounter and thinking about that there is so much left for us to encounter. And so, as you said, while we can lament the silences and the gaps and the things that are hard, there's still so much left to encounter. And that is amazing. Like over 400 letters, that's wild. Like that's so cool that is there for you to encounter and learn from. I'm looking forward to that. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Any other projects you are working on that you would like to talk about?
Oh gosh. I mean, I guess just this book is sort of what's foremost in my mind right now. And I'm hoping that there'll be an offshoot, because this girl's life is just sort of one chapter of many. But I'm hoping that her story can be an offshoot into another kind of like just a critical edition of her letters, right? Like just let her letters shine, with like minor annotations that kind of explain the context and sort of how she's moving across languages. And that does a little bit of translation work because she writes in English and in French. But I'm hoping that there will one day be a book that is just a compilation of a little Black girl's letters about New York and Haiti and France, and that, becomes something that is accessible, that people can kind of hold in their hands. That's a project I hope one day will come to fruition. So yeah.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so, so much for your time and for all of your insights. I greatly appreciate it. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your break.
So thank you. And thank you so much for having me and for these really thought-provoking questions. I really appreciate it.